Greetings all, and welcome to today's colloquium on the subject of diversity in post-tonal theory pedagogy. I'm happy to be able to present in public what I've been lucky enough to witness over a couple of months of email exchanges in private between our three guests. So all three of them are not only highly experienced scholars and teachers of post-tonal music, they approach the subject with an openness to new repertoire and a creativity regarding theoretical subject matter that it's rare in the field, and it's been inspiring to me. So yeah, as emails were passed back and forth, I found myself repeatedly bookmarking pieces and topics and such to incorporate into my own classes. So we're talking about diversity, and diversity is a matter of representation, of course, but it's a lot more than that. We can't expect that the same techniques that we've brought to one repertoire will remain sufficient as the repertoire expands and changes. So today we'll be talking about not only finding a repertoire, but rethinking the theoretical content and pedagogical goals of our post-tonal theory courses. So we're going to begin with 3 short papers by each of the panelists, and then we've left a long period for discussion afterwards. So we'll begin with Bob Hasegawa. So Bob Hassagawa is, of course, known to all of us, having last visited colloquium in December. He's associate professor at McGill University, and before then he was faculty here at Eastman. He was, in fact, my predecessor in the course Theory 205, the last semester of the undergraduate core, and I hesitate to confess how much of that course borrows from him. He's a specialist in timbre, in transformational theory, and in spectralist music. And his terrific article on Georg Friedrich Haas, which we read this week in Theory 513, won the Emerging Scholar Award from the Society for Music Theory. So take it away, Bob.
Great. Thanks so much, Zach. I just wanted to reiterate how great it is to be back at Eastman, and especially with Judy and Michael and Zach this afternoon. So I uploaded a file to the Zoom chat that just corrects some of the typos I found in the thing that was shared earlier. I think it has some notes on my talk today, too. I'll talk for about 10 minutes just to maybe introduce this topic and how I came to be interested in it and thinking about it. And then I would be happy to talk about the syllabi that I have in there, maybe during the discussion period. So I'm calling this short introductory talk, How Did We Get Here? I guess by here, I mean at an Eastman theory colloquium, talking about diversity in post-tonal music theory. And the second part of the title is, and why has it taken us so long? A lot of us have spent the last year and a half thinking a lot about questions of diversity in our field, and this reflection was sparked in many cases by the 2019 SMT keynote session, chaired by Betsy Marvin and featuring Phil Ewell, Joseph Strauss, who I see is here as well, Yayoi Everett, and Eli Hisama. While there are scholars in our field who have been pushing for greater diversity and equity for years, I think of Judy's work in championing women composers as a great example of this. I think it's fair to say that many of us, myself included, ignored the glaring exclusion of women and minorities from our syllabi, conferences, and journals for a shockingly long time. Why is it that this discussion is only just gaining steam in 2021? I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking myself as a relative newcomer to these issues, as one of many theorists who only started addressing these problems in the last couple of years. I think it's really important to reflect as a community on how we were able to ignore the racism and sexism of our field for so long, and why so many of us kept our heads buried in the sand until just quite recently. I thought back when preparing this talk to when I was an undergraduate in the early 90s and first getting into music theory study. At that time, my classes in 20th century music gave me the strong impression that there simply weren't many composers in the world, and that all of them were white men, mostly European but a few American, who all seemed to know, or at least know of each other, and to be part of the same conversation. For those of you who were in the field at that time, I would guess that this was characteristic of your experience as well. And it does seem to be the worldview that drives most of the post-tonal theory publications, textbooks, and syllabi of the time. This worldview is tied up deeply, of course, with the romantic notion of the genius, a tendency to see music history as formed by the actions of a few great men. And in this case, yes, they're all men on this list. The reality, which is now abundantly evident in our internet-connected present day, is that there are thousands of composers, sound artists, and improvisers active around the world. Innovation and excellence aren't the sole property of a small and Eurocentric group of white male composers. Rather, we can see extraordinary work coming from artists of widely diverse demographics and backgrounds. I'll mention here what improviser and musicologist Dana Reason has called the myth of absence. In her study of women in improvised music, the myth of absence summarizes how the lack of recognition of works by women in the press, in scholarship, and in concert programming leads to the assumption that women are not participating in the exploration and development of experimental, creative, improvised music. Reason demonstrates in her dissertation that this assumption is simply false, but that it remains stubbornly persistent. George Lewis, in a recent article, adopts Reason's idea of the myth of absence to talk about the erasure of the Afrodiasporic classical composer. When composers from marginalized groups are repeatedly left out of the scholarly conversation, the insidious result is that they're simply deemed not to exist. The facile assumption that there are no women or minority composers worthy of attention excludes them from the discourse, further reinforcing their invisibility in a vicious cycle. This is a deeply systematic problem in the fields of 20th and 21st century music theory and musicology. The myth of absence and its erasure of all but a handful of white male composers from our discourse is an ideology that's blinded us to the wider diversity of musical creativity. This systematized, ingrained discrimination is why so many of our mentors and models in the field, many of them who we know as kind and generous and humane people, saw absolutely no issue with research careers and theory curricula covering exclusively music by white men. I spent a lot of time locked within this limited worldview myself, and I think many theorists of my age did as well. In the course of my master's and PhD degrees, I can recall only one work by a non-Western composer and 0 works by women assigned for analysis in my courses. That's over 10 years of graduate school, in fact, 3 years for a master and 7 for a PhD. This is a really ugly history, I think, but I'm glad to see that we're now starting to have the difficult conversations which can help to break down this systematic racism and sexism. I do want to take a moment to address a particularly pernicious notion that often comes up in discussions about diversifying our curricula. I'm again going back to George Lewis, who's written really elegantly on this subject, and I want to talk about what he calls the quality or inclusion binary. This is the notion that a more inclusive selection process will necessarily result in a loss of quality, that adding works by diverse composers will mean lowering our musical standards. There's a clearly discriminatory ideology behind this binary, the assumption that in a pure meritocracy, white male composers would naturally be ranked at the top of the list, and that the inclusion of women or minorities must be based solely on their identity, since their works are somehow of lesser quality. As Lewis writes, this binary is aimed at preemptively foreclosing initiatives by non-majoritarians to win space, while portraying women and people of color as the only identity politicians around. Whiteness and maleness are identities too, of course, and the dismissal of challenges to their privileged position in Western culture as mere identity politics is nothing more than a mechanism to defend that privilege. So the PDF I've shared with you documents some steps I've taken to transform a rather traditional and I would say exclusionary post-tonal curriculum into a more inclusive and diverse course. While I don't in any way claim to have found an ideal solution, I hope that sharing my approach will be useful for others who are interested in curricular reforms. So the first page of the PDF shows the old version of my syllabus for the 5th semester undergrad core course here at McGill, Music Theory 350, Theory and Analysis 5. And yeah, as Zach said, this is quite similar to what I was teaching at Eastman 9 or 10 years ago in Theory 205. Looking at this now, I find it I'm looking at this rather sheepishly. I think the racism and sexism of the standard post-tonal canon is really evident here. There's just 2 works by non-white composers and 5 works by non-male composers out of a total of 36. There's a step to remedy this in my teaching. I taught an undergrad elective last fall called Music Theory 322, Topics in Post-Tonal Analysis, Rethinking the Post-Tonal Canon, and this is included on the second page of the handout. This course proposed a counter-canon made up exclusively of non-white and or non-male composers. This was a really terrific teaching experience for me. I found that the framing of the course as a counter-canon not only introduced me to new composers, but also made me rethink the theoretical topics I was including. And finally, on the third page of the handout, I show how I've reworked the core course Music Theory 350 in a more inclusive way, combining elements of the old version with new repertoire from the counter-canon course. Part of the decision-making process here involved the use of quotas to create a syllabus that more or less reflects the actual gender and ethnic demographics of Canada and the United States. So I'll close my introduction with the observation that post-tonal theory is actually a part of our discipline that is particularly promising for achieving equity and inclusion. As Michael points out in his chapter that he shared today, never before has the field of contemporary composition been as diverse or as active as it is now. And we're faced with a quite amazing wealth and variety of new music. I'd add a wealth and variety that's now very accessible through the internet, through score followers, through online scores, and so on. In music theory, we're still only making the first steps toward embracing this diversity, but I think it's a great moment to be working in post-tonal theory and analysis when all these things are really starting to expand and unfurl, and we're seeing, I think, new possibilities that would have been very hard to envision even 5 or 10 years ago. Okay, that's my introduction. I'll pass it on to, I think it will be Michael next. Or do we want to do introductions, Zachary? I think we're doing introductions, right? I got an introduction.
I will introduce Michael now. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, so Michael Buchler is professor of music theory at Florida State University and current president-elect of the Society for Music Theory. Professor Buchler's research focuses on Broadway musicals, analysis of 20th and 21st century music, and critiques of transformational analysis and set theory. And he is, of course, an Eastman PhD graduate. So welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really deeply honored to be invited to do this. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I'll share. I've also got just a short statement that I hope will raise more questions. Okay, so a little mise en scène. My first opportunity to teach 20th century music came during the last decade of the 20th century when I was a TA at Eastman, and I was thrilled to get to teach junior theory as it was known back then. It was a whole year of 20th century concert music. My very close grad school friend, Keith Waters, and I were the 2 TAs who were supervised by Dave Headlam, then an assistant professor. Dave, this is almost 30 years ago, which is just shocking to me. I was in heaven to get this opportunity. The curriculum had quite a lot of set theory, and in the second semester, a huge unit on 12-tone music, which was enough to really meaningfully differentiate the serial techniques of Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, Dalla Piccola, Stockhausen, and Babbitt. And we still had time to broach the stuff that was harder to discuss, harder to assign, harder to assess. Things like Luciano Berio's Symphonia, Kathy Berberian's rendition of Ticket to Ride, Peter Maxwell Davies' 8 Songs for a Mad King. Thinking of 3 pieces that really I enjoyed quite a bit and the undergrads enjoyed. As I said, I loved teaching this material, especially the formalist stuff. Spending time on the various partitional schemes of Schoenberg's Variations for Orchestra seemed utterly fascinating to me. But I also vividly recall being disappointed that my students didn't seem to share my excitement for how imaginative partitions could transform a single row class. In the mid-90s, I landed my first job. It was at the University of Iowa, where I had only 1 semester to cover what at Eastman had been 2 semesters of material. And that really had me hamstrung. I felt that conveying the clear methodologies that I knew I could teach effectively meant focusing on set classes, transformation, serialism, and I didn't recognize that our most practiced canonical techniques also carry with it an implicit bias toward organicism, and less broadly towards setting up shop firmly within pitch class space, which is certainly a place that I'm comfortable. I know my way around. I think we all understand that prolongational analysis with its attendant hierarchies is inherently organicist. And I don't say that as a negative, it just is. But in and after grad school, I guess I kind of thought of pitch class sets and the theories that surround them as more or less value neutral. Well, at least once K and KH tables fell out of fashion. But what do you do when your taxonomy of choice doesn't foster a pervasive sense of relatedness within a piece? Can you have a successful analysis that fails to show how all the parts fit together? When I was a student at Eastman, I constructed various similarity relations to relate sets and draw connections that weren't strictly canonical. Of course, I was following a long line of others, including my advisor, Bob Morris, who had also constructed similarity measures, but with different algorithms. In fairness, I should say that Bob tried to talk me off the similarity measure ledge at one point, but I just wasn't dissuaded. Other people stretched our notions of relatedness in diverse ways. Joe Strauss, hi Joe, has offered near or fuzzy transformations. Henry Klumpenhauer combined transformations into a single network. David Lewin expanded the dimensions by which we might understand equivalence or motions within a space. But again, what about music that just doesn't cohere in ways that we can readily describe and clearly teach? What of music that doesn't more or less move in some seemingly deliberate way through a conceptual space that we can imagine and draw? In stepping outside our established categories of musical organization, I find Dora Hannonen's and Judy Lotkin's books and articles to be absolutely invaluable, both as assigned readings for my graduate classes and in shaping my constantly shifting pedagogical philosophy for my undergrads. I still love telling organicist analytical stories. They're so compelling and they make you feel like you really get a piece of music, but they're also limiting in that students tend to believe that music that doesn't seem to fit so neatly together lies somehow beyond analysis. We've heard that term. I certainly don't think that we need to stop telling organicist analytical stories, but fostering musical diversity requires that we stop valuing those stories above other kinds of analytical narratives. So now let me say a few words about the course plans that I distributed to you. And I've got another one as well if you'd like, but we can talk about that later on. I'm currently teaching an upper level undergraduate class called 20th Century Styles. Yes, 20th century. It's really tough to change course titles in the state university system in Florida. And last fall, for the first time in a decade, I taught the first semester of our graduate atonal and analysis curriculum. I also regularly teach the second semester of grad atonal theory. If you read my chapter in Lee Van Handel's Pedagogy, and no harm, no foul if you didn't, you saw that I elected not to teach set class analysis in my undergrad course. This semester, I also made the difficult choice to remove my abbreviated unit on 12-tone technique. To be honest, one of the reasons that I felt that I could do this is that my colleague Jane Clendenning, who coordinates our core fourth semester undergraduate theory course here, covers serial music and also set theory, at least briefly. Instead of engaging with set classes, I talk about motives and musical gestures and how they can be defined and applied. In lieu of my unit on serialism, I assigned several 20th century fugues and canons. Through Ravel, Bartók, Fine, and Hindemith, I can cover transposition, inversion, and even retrograde, and I can do so in music where these canonical transformations are readily audible, even when, in the case of Vivian Fine's 4 polyphonic pieces, the transformations occasionally collapse from the realm of pitch into the more abstract pitch class landscape. If you look through my topics list, you've seen that my undergrad class has a lot more music in it than does my graduate class. All concepts are taught through music. I don't use a textbook and I focus on conventional techniques. Perhaps fancifully, I divided the course into 4 central parts. One modernist unit that focuses on scales and collections. Another modernist unit that focuses on counterpoint and motive. That's where the fugues and the canons make their entrances, so to speak. A unit on repetition that I called Minimalisms, which starts off with Debussy's highly repetitive footsteps in the Snow Prelude and Stravinsky's Serenade in A, and by introduces works of Louis Andriessen, Steve Reich, Julius Eastman, Jyrki Ligeti, Anna Klein, and Eun-Suk Chin. Finally, I have a unit on extended technique vocal music that includes aspects of modernism and minimalism, and also shows examples of music as social and political activism. I'd never stake a political position within my courses, but especially nowadays, it seems right to have students consider the role of music and text, and I mean text writ large, in works like Andreessen's Workers' Union, Julia Wolf's Anthracite Fields, and Kate Soper's Only the Words Themselves Say What They Mean. A quick word about my graduate atonal classes. In my first semester course, I adopted Joe Strauss's book and I teach much of the material in it while assigning a classic repertoire and works that are surely less known to my students. I want my students to know some works by Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, Anton Weber, and Igor Stravinsky, Kaya Saariaho, and Thomas Addis, to name a few. But I intermingle them with Joanna Bayer, Elizabeth Lutyens, Isang Yoon, Evan Williams, and Jesse Montgomery, composers that they're less likely to have encountered. And in my second semester atonal theory class, I decided about 8 years ago or so to teach nothing but 21st century music, and more than 50% of my choices are by women and other minoritized composers. In all of my courses on atonal music, I really hope that by using many works by women and BIPOC composers, but distinctly not eliminating all the dead white dudes, I'm able to highlight great music by composers who have had to clear considerable cultural barriers. And I try to do so without tearing down successful composers who have benefited from their substantial positions of cultural privilege, as indeed I have. I know that many or most of you have probably taught or are listening to and studying other repertoire that can further enhance what and how I teach. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So finally, we have Judy Lotkin. She is professor of music theory and history at Stony Brook University. She is a music theorist and musicologist whose work focuses on the most recent musical practices in North America and Europe. And her recent book, which I find to be deeply pertinent to issues we're discussing today and really just very helpful in this regard, is Reconceiving Structure: New Tools in Music Theory and Analysis. So welcome, Judy.
Thank you so much. Really honored to be here and to be part of this discussion. And I will say that at Stony Brook right now, we're having a really heated exchange about our undergraduate curriculum and what it's going to be. So this is really helpful for me to think about, what might happen there. But I also want to say that I have a somewhat different circumstance than I think Bob and Michael do, in the sense that I don't actually, right now, I'm not teaching that undergrad sequence, basic theory sequence. We got to the situation at Stony Brook where the composers wanted to hold on to that course. And so they have retained control of it, although I don't know how long that's going to happen. And so I would always teach music analysis courses. So I did teach those courses when I was a mere babe, so to speak, but over the last 20 or so years, I have not taught those courses. But I do teach undergraduate and graduate music theory or music analysis courses. Recently, because I've been doing a lot of administration, I've only been teaching graduate courses. So it's given me a certain amount of privilege to do some pretty, experimental things that I might not have been able to do otherwise. I will also say that I do teach a first semester music major class that we call sound structures. And it's supposed to be a beginning introduction, an introduction to the materials of music. But that's music writ large. So in that class, we teach canonic Western classical music of the present, past and present musics in rock and roll, past and present musics in jazz. And I taught classical Indian music. I taught some music from African traditions, especially Mbura, and some on gamelan and some in traditional Japanese music. So I had to stretch quite a bit to learn about those things and sort of feel like I was learning at the same time as everyone else. So that was an interesting kind of process that went on. So what I don't have a speech per se. I want to talk about what I've been reading lately. And it made me think about music theory and what does it mean to do music theory and music analysis. So I've been reading this book that's called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, second edition. And it was the second edition was published in 2012. The first edition was published in 1999. So it's been around for a while. So this book is by Linda Hiwai Smith. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Her topic is really about research and critical epistemology. So she is Indigenous and she's New Zealander. She was trying to establish what she called an Indigenous research agenda. But primarily what she's up to is this kind of decentering colonial research, right? So, but she links that to very basic things like knowledge, what we choose to study, and then how we study it. So I got to thinking, do we think of music theory and analysis as research, or do we think of it as something else, right? And so that's a question that I said, well, let's see what they say in Grove, right? So I went to see what the Grove articles said, and there's some new entry. I didn't know this one existed until this morning in Grove by David Carson Berry and Sherman van Solkema from 2014. And it's the title of the article is just theory, right? And I mean, I know the Poliska article there, and then on analysis, it's Ian Bentz, right? So I don't know exactly why they have this one, but anyway, Carson Berry and van Solkema write this. They say, an area of theory is an area of study that tends to focus on musical materials per se, so materials, and it looks at the principles and processes. And then toward the end of that statement, they say, music theory refers to an academic discipline with a dual focus on research and pedagogy. So research shows up in their description of it, but it doesn't show up in either Poliska's or Bentz when they talk about theory and analysis. So Poliska, which was also written with Ian Bent, and that's from 2001, so it hasn't been updated very recently. It starts, theory is now understood as principally the study of the structure of music. This can be divided into melody, rhythm, counterpoint, harmony, and form. And then he goes on and talks about various things. So, but research doesn't show up. There's no sense that what we do might be research. So then Ian Bent, in writing his well-known analysis article, he starts with, he says, music analysis is that part of the study of music that takes as its starting point the music itself, rather than external factors. And we know the history of that. And then he goes on, more formally, analysis may be said to include the interpretation of structures in music, together with their resolution into relatively simpler constituent elements and the investigation of the relevant functions of those. So when I was rereading the Ian Bent this morning, sort of thinking about, what can we think of music theory as an analysis as research? The phrase that Ian Bent used there, where he says the interpretation of structures in music as if they kind of pre-exist our engagement with them, struck me as really relevant to this issue of whether what we do can be understood as discovery or research, right? So if it's research, it's a more active construction of what's there. I mean, I'm not saying that we make the structure in the music, but we have to engage it in such a way that what we're doing is an active engagement with the music. And we have to then reflect on how we come to that process of understanding music, that it has to be a reflection on what we bring to it as much as what the music brings to it. So that brings me back to decolonizing methodologies. So if we go back to this book that I've been reading lately to get ready to change our undergraduate curriculum here at Stony Brook, she writes about what she calls colonial or imperial knowledge, and she links it to the idea of the archive. So in the West, there's this notion that we have an archive of knowledge, and that order actually comes from that archive of knowledge. And so when the archive is written by a certain type of person and with a certain kind of perspective, then the kind of order that comes from that archive is very tightly linked to what that is, right? So the archive then becomes a store of these past and the way I was thinking about it, the archive becomes a store of past and present musical concepts. And there's a tendency to want to perpetuate that order and that archive, right? But where we get to, and this is links to what Michael was saying, that poiesis, the creation of music, is not necessarily this perpetuation of the archive and order. And so the study of music then is one of these things where you have to be examining the archive, which is to say our existing concepts, as much as it is about examining the music. And so that leads me to I think some of the questions that I had posed and things that were provided is, we have to interrogate the concepts and tools that we bring to our process. And, what do these existing tools we have reveal? Does melody actually apply? I mean, some of the pieces that I analyzed this past semester with my students had nothing resembling a melody in them. There's no way. They didn't really have harmonies either. So these are concepts that are not workable for those pieces. I can provide something else, but they won't be useful to me in trying to understand what the music is. And so then you also have to think, well, how do these tools affect not only how we think about the music, but what we hear, right? Because we have ear training. We learn to hear certain kinds of things. Do those concepts affect what we create? And then sort of wondering what the alternatives are. So I'm not going to give lots of ideas here, but I'm going to suggest one thing that I do with my students to try to get them out of the habit of engaging existing concepts, just to, clear out the cobwebs out of your brain, I suppose. I do something with them that I call metaphoric transcription. So we start prior to looking at a score, if the score exists, and just getting them to do some kind of metaphoric transcription of the sound in whatever way. It could be written, it could be making a sculpture, it could be doing something else. So they start to think and hear the music in ways that are not constrained by the archive, so to speak, that they've been trained to. So those are just a couple ideas. I understand my privilege of having students in my class who've gone through curricula like Bob's and Michael's. And so I don't have to kind of tackle that problem. Sometimes I have to undo it a little bit, and then you come back to it, not saying that those are not useful concepts, but I have been able to do a lot of exploration because I'm only teaching graduate students. So anyway, I recommend the book, Decolonizing Methodologies. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have nearly an hour for discussion and lots to potentially engage here, but I think I'll begin by just opening it to you all.
I'll ask a provocative question. How much, I'm pulling off of Judy's talk, but I'm wondering how much you do with works that don't have a score and how you approach that.
So we did this last semester. Stony Brook had an opportunity for us to invite somebody to campus, to Zoom. And I partnered with August Sheehy, who some of you may know, who teaches undergrad theory at Stony Brook. And we combined our two classes. So he was teaching the last semester of the theory sequence for undergrads, and I was teaching my grad seminar. And we invited Tishan Sori to come and speak with us. And we focused on this piece called Invisible Rituals, which is actually a duo between him and Jennifer Curtis, who's a violinist. She's in ICE ensemble, but she also does a lot of what we sometimes call spontaneous composition. So there was only a recording. And so we handled it differently in our two classes. Since I had the grad class, I had them all do some sort of transcription of a movement. And it didn't necessarily be a notational description. It could have been some graphic that represent what happened and what the various elements were. So we created something that then could be analyzed and went about it that way. The undergraduates in August's class were, they more kind of posed questions and were responding to it. So they weren't quite as prepared, I think, to do this, but I think they got a lot out of it, and they got to talk to him, and it was fun. They posed the questions. We just stood in the background and had them do it. But part of what you have to do is you have to create something visual to use as a basis for doing the analysis.
Betsy, if I could chime in on this one too. When I was working on the counter canon syllabus I did last fall, this was a big issue, and there were works by Ellen Fullman. Ellen Fullman is this sound artist and composer who plays on this long string instrument. It's amazing. You should all check it out. But she has these event scores that I found really hard to match up to the sound. So she had in an article a little excerpt, but I puzzled over it for hours and I couldn't make it exactly line up, and I decided eventually not to include that one. I had the same issue with a piece by Anthony Braxton that had a score, but the full score was very hard to find. It was on index cards in color. I couldn't even figure out where to buy a copy or find a copy anywhere, so I left that out as well. I did end up including 3 pieces that were without scores in that curriculum, though. One was a piece by Henry Threadgill, which was an improvised piece. There I drew on transcriptions in a dissertation, which were really useful and really well done. So I would add that this kind of preliminary work on new composers and underrepresented composers goes a long way. There were certain things in my syllabus I was only able to do because someone had a dissertation on them or a conference paper that gave me just enough to grab onto to share with students. So for Threadgill, we used transcriptions. For a piece by Roscoe Mitchell, we used transcriptions again in an MTO article, which had some really detailed looks at this piece, Nonea. And then finally, for this piece by Pamela Z, we were able to discuss it in some detail because it had a lot of loops and repetition, and it was pretty easy to grab onto it without having to do a detailed transcription. So I would say those have been my approaches. I've talked to some colleagues who use like a digital audio workstation, like Audacity or something like that, to help students to engage with things without scores and have that visual representation kind of automatically made, either as the frequency amplitude or the amplitude waveform or like a spectrogram. I think there might be interesting opportunities there for certain kinds of music.
I guess I'll just pop in as well and say I've done much less of that, I think, than my colleagues have. Although I have assigned, I remember particularly work by Lenny Lilios in electronic composition, especially with live electronics, that was very hard. And I asked students to, not to notate exactly, but to sort of explain or diagram or talk about in some ways to verbalize what they were hearing. The much harder thing that I brought into class in my advanced graduate seminar, the work Up Close by Michel van der Aa, which won the Grawemeyer Prize some years ago. The challenge of that one is it's a fully notated score, except that it also has a lot of interaction with video. it's a cello and chamber orchestra, but where the cellist really has this integrated role, and it's very actorial with a character who looks like the cellist in the video, in a surrealistic video. So the figuring out how to actually bring in this other facet of video poses some of the same challenges, I think, that Betsy mentioned of working without a score.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Can I jump in here real quick? First of all, thanks for fantastic talks. All of your students are so lucky and fortunate to be learning from me. I hope they appreciate that. So my question is really sort of a devil's advocate kind of big sort of philosophical question about repertory and why we teach what we teach. So in all of this discussion about diversity that's been so active in the last 6 months, there's been a lot of talk about hierarchy, especially with regard to the Schenkerian stuff. But another hierarchy that maybe doesn't get as much notice is the hierarchy created by highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow. Those are hierarchies that are also socially and politically constructed. And the music that we're talking about, most of it is markedly highbrow. And it's so highbrow that it's even highbrow inside of highbrow. Some of our music students don't particularly like the music, and they're totally bought into the highbrow thing. So I mean, you know, considering the fact that I've spent a lot of time talking about Schoenberg and Hauer and 20th century music, so I'm all in with post-tonal music and all that. But when we, in a larger discussion, when we defend why it is we're even really concerned about including this material, especially in an undergraduate curriculum, when there are so many other repertories that are so much more easily diverse and representative, why in the world would we be worried about serialism and set theory? And again, devil's advocate, okay, so that's not me, that's just the position.
I'll take a preliminary swing at that, John. It's a great question. It's a challenging question. I think one thing I'd like to see is more inclusion of popular music, and I don't want to say lowbrow, but let's say popular music across the theory curriculum. And honestly, I don't see why in tonal theory we can't be covering at least some jazz theory and some theory about rock. I know in some of my tonal classes, which I don't teach that often, but I sometimes get a chance to, I've taught with Nicole Biamonte's article about pentatonicism and rock music, for example. We use some of Mark Levine's jazz theory book just to get a kind of passing acquaintance with those. And they fit beautifully into a chromatic harmony kind of syllabus, I think. They make a lot of sense there. I think it's true that this is a rather highbrow kind of, it's true, these all belong to basically a Western art music tradition and to a particularly narrow corner of that. I guess for me, it's important to have some place to talk about difficult and perhaps little known music, which is pushing certain boundaries. The question of whether it's taking the place of something else, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that really. We're always leaving things out. I'd be delighted to have more music that was looking at, say, world traditions and so on, and to have those classes in our curriculum too. I feel like I would really defend the place of something like this though, maybe not instead of, but in addition to those other things.
Okay, I'll take it. Oh, go ahead, Judy, sorry.
Okay, I'll go next. Switch up the order. So as I said, I was teaching graduate students, and they're coming to do difficult music. So can I say, it was composers and students in our history theory program, and not all of them are going to do the so-called difficult music, but some of them are. And I will say, you know, in my grad seminar, I don't say they have to do a final project, and I don't say what music they should do. The only instructions I give them is it has to be something produced in the 21st century. So what I got for papers last semester is I got somebody doing Dillinger Escape Plan, Arcade Fire. Let me see some of the others. There was a couple that I was unacquainted with, and I'm not going to remember what their names are. But I would say 50% of the papers that came out of that grad seminar were not on Western art music. So if you give people the choice to do what they want, but you give them some methods to approach it, then they'll produce something. And then, I mean, they can use what we learned about Chaya Chernowan in the same way that they can learn about Dillinger's escape plan, right? I think there's some of the same issues there. So the other thing, and I will speak for my colleague August Sheehy here, who was teaching this undergrad last semester of the 20th century very chromatic harmony in 20th century techniques, and he chose to in that class include some music by Ellington, and then he gave the students choice to pick what they wanted to, and they ended up analyzing some punk songs. So there was a way to build it into that, in particular, that stage of the theory sequence. And I will also say that one of the things that we're, proposing to do in our rewrite of the undergrad curriculum here is to not say that there is a music theory. It's a music theory of what kind of music? Music theory of the Western classical tradition, or is this going to be jazz theory, or is it going to be a theory of popular music? Or so it is specified, so it's not this assumption of what the music is that's being studied. So that's kind of the way we're thinking about things.
All righty. I have sort of two answers that I want to give to this question. First of all, yes, it's a great question. The first question, the first one, I guess, is to answer a question with a question. What do you do when your students have a certain expectation? And this is a little bit of what Judy got to with, she's dealing with composers and they want to study particular kinds of music. I'm actually thinking of not our curriculum at FSU, which is fairly diverse, although not as much as it could be, obviously. But my hometown school, Cleveland Institute of Music, which has declared itself to be a classical-only conservatory. And as such, they do not teach anything from the Great American Songbook, much rock. But that's the audience. Students understand the deal when they enroll at CIM. And I sort of wonder, is that okay in this day and age to teach a purely classical curriculum, understanding that that's the audience that has come there for exactly that reason. And there would be less of that at Eastman, but certainly the same kinds of questions, given how obviously Eastman's not entirely classical, but a large number of students are going there to study classical music. FSU still a little bit less. So the other thing that I would say is that I've been so tempted to mix my classes. I'm doing a doctoral seminar right now in musical theater, and I've never had a higher enrollment. Like all of our doctoral students are taking it, and I had 3 master's students beside who petitioned to get in. So that's great. But within that, and that's distinctly, it's not lowbrow, but it's definitely not as highbrow as some of the stuff you're talking about. It's people pay a lot of money to get tickets to Broadway shows when let's hope they come back. But within that repertoire, there certainly is music that could go into a curriculum, like an atonal curriculum. Sondheim, certainly, some of it, not all of it. And Janine Tesori has some interesting recent work. So I want to bring in, I did once bring in some Broadway stuff, but it's so hard to figure out what to leave out as it is. Yeah, I don't think that's a very satisfying answer to your question, John, but yeah, I'll just stop there.
If I could just comment briefly and say, I mean, I don't know what the answer is either. And I'm not, of course, I'm a big advocate for popular music in the undergraduate curriculum, but I'm not an advocate for Schoenberg, Webern, Boulez, and being out either. Mm-hmm. But, when we start to think about who's being privileged and who's not being privileged, part of it has to do with the way society's culture has been constructed. And let's face it, highbrow has been mostly sort of an affluent white kind of active, area of culture. And so the fact that we can't find as much diversity as we would hope is hardly an accident. And so I think to a certain extent, we have to kind of defend why we should include things that only we seem to care a lot about. We have to talk our students into it. And some of our students won't be talked into it, and audiences have a difficult time. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm all for including it. I just don't know how we, not how we justify it, but how we find a blend, a balance that works.
Just a quick follow-up to that, John. It occurs to me that maybe a more repertoire neutral argument for including this kind of music, this sort of difficult music or experimental music or avant-garde music, is that it does give students a lot of doors into different ways of conceiving what music is. I think maybe at the broadest level, that's why I would say it's really good to look at music which challenges the idea of maybe not having melodies or harmony, as Judith said, or music that's based on timbre, or music that's entirely improvised but not in any mode or scale. It seems like it gives them a lot of tools in which to say, well, music can be a lot of things besides what we're used to. I think that would be my broadest defense of this. And then thinking about this question of highbrow music or elitist music, one thing I do like about teaching this repertoire is that, sure, if you look at what was going on in, say, the early 20th century into the 70s and 80s, it is a lot of white men that we're talking about. You mentioned Boulez and Schoenberg and so on. But this is the one part of the classical music repertoire which is still growing. And I think that's really interesting to see. I saw a Facebook thing recently about a competition for Iranian composers. They had 50 applicants with pieces that were being recorded. And I think it is getting better in representation, especially if we start to define difficult music and experimental music to include people like George Lewis or Henry Threadgill or Roscoe Mitchell. Maybe that's kind of a broader category we could aspire to. So all kinds of experimentation.
I wanted to change my answer to Bob's answer.
I agree with Bob too, but I started thinking about teaching a class as more kind of like putting together a program for a recital, where you try to have the pieces speak to one another, but they might be different styles. I mean, people are, playing Ligeti etudes and interleaving it with Bach because they've heard some way for those pieces to speak to one another. And so if you think of the choices you make in a class as not, oh, I have to cover this canonic composer, I have to do this thing, but you think about how those pieces can speak to one another in interesting or contrast with one another, right? So I think the way you put together repertoire for a class, it needs to be rethought, because a lot of it is sort of focused around canonic composers and canonic concepts.
I want to follow up with changing the subject a little, with a point that Michael brought up in his talk, which is that one of the biases we are dealing with is a bias for pattern identification, which manifests sort of most elaborately in organicism. And yeah, I'm curious if each of the three of you could reflect on what other musical values you focus on in classes and that deal with repertoire that maybe is less bound up with elaborate patterns, perhaps derived from organicism. And then also just sort of practically how you realize lesson plans and assignments that help students grasp those values.
All right, I'll start since you mentioned me. It's so hard to do that. It's so, and I don't really know how we let go of our bias toward organicism. And it actually took me quite a long time, as I said, to realize that set theory also had this bias to it, that if you're not finding the same thing replicated over and over again, what do you have? You've got this kind of set and a that kind of set and a that kind of set, and it's kind of a mishmash of nothing. So when looking at pieces that I wanted to cover and thinking, do they check all the boxes? I mean, I was quickly dismissing pieces that I couldn't make work in some way. And I realized that was giving me a particular bias toward modernism. And I don't want to convey that I think that women or BIPOC composers aren't as good at organicism as white dudes are. But I think that in the current compositional space that we're in, the diversity of our current compositional landscape, there's a lot of things going on that aren't just wholly unified pieces. There's this incredible diversity of aesthetic. Call it postmodernism, call it whatever you want, but the idea that pieces don't have to internally cohere in some way, I think is rather pervasive now, that we don't need to, that they don't need to be in one single style. And as I said in my article, given that the compositional landscape is more diverse than ever, learning how to live in that space means gives you much more opportunity to have a diverse compositional landscape, or to choose women and BIPOC composers, because there's just so many more of them now than have ever been active. So that's the kind of partial answer to that. But in terms of getting past that and making assignments, sometimes I ask students what stories they tell. Sometimes I always try in my assignments to have some kind of combination of more formal kinds of questions, things that the students who are nervous about, right and wrong can, feel confident about attacking, and then other questions, more and more of them, that are much more interpretive and open. So in the interpretive and open one, I mean, I do ask my students to think about what stories pieces tell, and what, what's the kind of narrative of this work, not to introduce any particular kind of narrative theory behind it, but just to sort of think about an analysis as a story. And what kind of story is this? What's going on here? How can we relate things in ways that don't have to be, everything doesn't have to be interrelated to each other?
I'll follow up, I guess. The idea of looking at form or overall shape, I think, is very adaptable and can look at all sorts of music. So talking about the form and making sure that students are getting into engagement with the piece at that level, where they can describe the form or make a chart of it. Sometimes I've used Brian Elegant's idea of road maps, which can be interesting. Sometimes I've just had them make kind of a segmentation of the piece into different segments and talk about how they hear them as being related to each other or contrasting with each other. And you can do that in a lot of musical genres, kind of regardless of the musical language at play. I guess something I spend a lot of time doing as well is trying to figure out what exactly are the elements of the musical language for a given piece, whether that's something very strict and very quantifiable, like set class analysis, or finding particular modes or particular types of verticalities, things like that, or if it's a little bit looser about just the general materials that are being used, whether they're timbral or microtonal. And I guess some of this takes us a little bit more towards what's often called description than analysis. And I feel like there's often this tension in music theory where people say, well, you're just describing it. You're not really analyzing the piece yet. And this makes me think a bit of what Judy wrote about in her article that was circulated, and especially this bit at the end. I'm just going to read from that a moment. She says, art criticism may be understood not as an explanation of art practice, but rather as a means of intensifying and generating new experiences of art. So in a lot of cases, I've been thinking along those models, is trying to get a closer engagement, not necessarily to explain. I think organicism is all about explaining. It's this way because that's the most coherent way. I'm not sure that's a great way to listen to a lot of contemporary music. And I think when we give our students this idea that contemporary music is sort of a puzzle to be solved. I sometimes say it's not, you're not trying to crack the code. That's not the point. It often makes them a lot more able to engage with that music. And I think it's not a very appealing idea to think of music as being a kind of puzzle or a kind of, a code to be cracked. It's nice to be able to say, well, it is what it is. I'll try to figure out exactly what that means, exactly how I hear it. So I guess it's true. It is moving towards description from this kind of solution model, but in some ways I think that's healthier.
I'll follow up a little bit on that. I totally agree that I mean, one of the virtues of doing these kind of metaphorical transcriptions is that they are a kind of description, but in putting, making some kind of visualization, you end up having to conceptualize what you're hearing in some way, and that is part descriptive. It's also partly explanatory when you're doing that, although it's not the kind of explanation where you tie everything up in a nice bow, right? That it's doing something else. So I totally understand the question, Zach, though. It's always satisfying when you can have this great pattern that you've noticed in something. So I have two stories I'll tell to maybe exemplify some of this. One has to do with I spent an inordinate amount of time with this piece by Chernowan called Anea Crystal. And it's one of these pieces for string quartet. There's actually two string quartets sometimes, and but it's got all sorts of so-called extended techniques and so forth. And I just, the more I listen to it, it's like, oh yeah, I start hearing relationships over time. And so I can't say that they're patterns, but they're definitely relationships. I did not hear those the first time I listened to that piece, or even the third time I listened to the piece. So there's this process of understanding that comes when you start to engage it. And those are all possible relationships. I can't say that everybody would necessarily hear those, but as I've spent a lot of time with it, I started to hear those kinds of things. And, that kind of brings me back to that prior question I had, is how do our concepts cue us to ways of listening and engaging the music? So I think those things are related. And then the other story really has to do with a paper that a student wrote for me last semester. And it was about a piece by Christopher Cerrone. And the piece, I think the title of the piece is Spirals, Meanders, and Explosions, or something like that. And it's based on a literary criticism book by an English scholar. And the meander, the spiral, and the explosion are techniques of novelistic writing that she has noted, right? And none of those are about patterns. They're not about, here's the climax and here's the thing, but here's the thing that meanders, right? And here's one that has a spiral, and here's one that explodes, right? So those are all strategies, right? They can be strategies of music as well as strategies of literature. So they're not necessarily pattern recognition, but they're more about what Bob was referring to as formal design of a piece.
Can I hop in again and comment on both on what Judy just said and what Bob's just said? Form, yes, absolutely. Form is a great way. I'll also say that I've taken to giving my classes larger works because I can ask more broad questions about them. In fact, multi-movement works. How do the 5 movements of this string quartet cohere with each other? How do they relate to one another? And this is a notion of form that's much bigger, and that I've actually been applying even more, to cross over to the other side of my life here, into musical theater. I've been asking my doctoral seminar to think about form, not just the small forms of songs or phrase structure, but form writ large. Fiddler on the Roof is a kind of rotational piece. as every one of Tevye's daughters get married. So there's aspects of form, and a lot of this kind of form, a lot of like really larger scale form, thinking about what the function, and especially narrative function, of particular songs are within a musical, can be replicated in a lot of what we do in post-tonal life as well. And I take my inspiration from here, in addition to Judy and her works in which she said that notions of spirals work very, very well. Was it the Stacey Garrett analysis in your piece that uses, or?
Anna Klein.
Anna Klein piece, yeah, sorry. Inflating chapters of your book. But I also am kind of inspired by what Clifton Boyd is called a vernacular music theory. I'm reading a lot of like ruminations of playwrights and what goes on in, say, the BMI workshop in New York City as composers are coached, and this kinds of song types and the sorts of functions that they have played into my notion of form on a very large scale. And I find that my work in musical theater has had me looking at much larger stretches of music in atonal class as well. When I take out the detail, you can see much bigger pictures.
I think one solution to this too is also perhaps to bring in some free writing, that not everything has to be expressed in purely abstract theoretical terms. We can ask students to write about certain parts of the music, maybe to look for things. And some pieces that are particularly difficult to analyze from a pitch perspective, I've asked them in kind of an open format question as an assignment to look for repetitions, for example. Are there any repetitions? I've asked them to say, well, if pitch isn't the main element of this music, what else might be organizing the music or organizing the way you hear it? These are all kind of preliminary questions, right? That's a long way from a detailed analysis, but if they take those questions seriously, sometimes with a bit of a sort of scavenger hunt within the music, find a place where something recurs, find a place where the rhythmic grid is broken up, find a place where the notation could allow different interpretations. Sometimes that gives them a chance to just engage with the piece and spend the time listening and looking through the score to find things. That's a pretty good assignment by my evaluation. That maybe in class you can develop some more detailed and more rigorous things, but to me, a lot of the assignments are just about finding ways to engage with an unfamiliar piece. And I think that's kind of what I want my students to be able to do at the end of a post-tonal course. It's not so important to me that they can come up with a brilliant kind of organic analysis like David Lewin would, but most of us can't do that even on a good day, right? That's a really high thing to ask undergrads to do. I feel like what I want them to be able to do, though, is not be a new score they come across, to feel like, oh, I know how to flip through the score and find some things that make sense. I know how to look for formal structures. I know how to maybe find what I think is the climax or the denouement of a work. That seems like that might already be a lot, just being able to engage, being confident enough to engage that way.
Can I jump in with a question? Really generally for all of the panelists, and thank you all for really, it's been a terrific discussion, and the materials are great and really interesting to explore. So one of the questions I have, it's sort of a very practical kind of concern, is on the one hand, like to what degree do you consider introducing conversations about things like identity and marginalization into the classroom when you're talking about musics that aren't by white male composers? And then also, do those conversations change if it's, for example, a graduate seminar where everyone has chosen to be in the course, an elective where students have chosen to be in the course, or this kind of course designed around a counter canon, versus a core required course where everyone has to be there, the administration, the department, and the instructor are all buying into the fact that this is something every music student needs for their degree? And do those conversations change when there's that pressure of a core course versus something like an elective? And just any thoughts you have on the kinds of conversations you have with students about identity and marginalization and these kinds of things. Thank you.
Well, I'll start first this time. I mean, it is different in a graduate class because they are there for a much different kind of reason. They've chosen to go to graduate school for one thing, and to be in music as graduate students. And you know, I think what my experience has been is those issues come up kind of organically, given the topic of the pieces that we chose. So we studied, last semester we studied Lei Liang's, I always get the title wrong, 1,000 Mountains, a Million Streams. I think that's the name of it. And in that, he is, you know, he's evoking some Chinese practices, right? I mean, it's a very Western piece, but he's doing that. And so there were some Asian students in the class, and they filled me in on stuff I didn't know, you know? And so they were quite upfront about doing that, and it was fine, and it was good. We all taught one another in that sense, right? The other piece we did was by Lisa Lim, and it's called Extinction Events. And so we talked a lot about climate change as a consequence of that. So it wasn't so much about identity per se, but more about current issues. So those things came up as part of the discussion of the music. So I mean, and I think it's for the class that I was teaching, it was really useful, you know. So
I guess, Sam, that's a great question. In the undergrad class, which I taught, which was the counter canon model, that was an elective class, and the students were really enthusiastic. They already had had a lot of 20th century theory from my core class, so they were kind of ready to go with that. We actually kind of left this questions mostly to the side, so I didn't explicitly foreground issues of identity, inclusion, exclusion for that matter too, but they did come up naturally sometimes. I remember when we talked about Julius Eastman, for example, his story is so sad, and the reason his music is in kind of this partial form in a lot of ways, the kind of fragmentary scores and things like that, is a really sad story. And I think it naturally became part of the discussion there. I was teaching a grad seminar at the same time dealing with a lot of these issues, and that was very political, and we made it very foregrounded. So we were reading things about that and talking about theories about race, theories about gender, theories about course design and curricula. So there it was very explicit, but for the undergrads I decided to kind of underplay it, if anything, but it did come up naturally, I think, at enough moments to make it really stick in a way, to make those points as I wanted to.
I don't have much to add to that other than I think I operate in kind of a similar way. Sometimes it's worth foregrounding, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I intentionally, especially, I'll say that I was less good about diversifying in terms of BIPOC composers than I was in terms of gender. And I didn't mention that I did mention that in my, say, advanced atonal class that I would be doing nothing but 21st century music, but I didn't say that I'd be choosing at least half women. I thought it would be kind of gently amusing to do a one, I haven't done it yet, but to have like one token male composer. But I specifically don't say anything because I just want to normalize that this is what a compositional landscape looks like.
Could I ask a question? First of all, hello, everybody. It's so nice to be with this group. I miss you all. I wanted to ask a question about textbooks. When I wrote the first edition of my post-tonal theory book back in the late 80s, I deliberately chose to draw all the examples from just 5 composers: Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg, and Stravinsky, and Bartók. And I was totally unself-conscious about that. I was following sort of the Aldwell-Schachter tradition. I thought these are the master works and these are the master composers, and that's what I was going to do. And I had no self-consciousness about it whatsoever. Over the years, I've done my best, and I know I can do more, and I will do more to diversify both the theoretical concepts and the range of composers who I talk about. But there's something inherent in a textbook that I think maybe doesn't work anymore in an age that's so radically and properly decentralized as the age we seem to be moving into here, because textbooks by their very nature always restrict the content. There's a limit to the number of pages and therefore a limit to the number of composers. There's always a kind of implicit canonicity that's going on. You're canonizing certain approaches and certain composers, whether you like it or not. And so textbooks are designed always to enforce a kind of consensus. And I wonder what you all think about the role of a textbook. Is it obsolete now? Is it inevitably tied to antiquated notions of a kind of consensus that was always fictional and is inherently oppressive? And we should just, go our ways and let what happens and not sort of cling to this increasingly untenable notion that we're all sort of doing the same thing and we're all in this together, because really, in a way, we're not.
I'll hop in, I guess. First of all, as I said, it's been a decade since I taught our first semester atonal theory class. And when I picked it up again this past fall, I debated not using a textbook at all. I have enough materials of my own, but I also thought, particularly in times of COVID, I was so grateful to have your book. I was so grateful to see how much the book had changed since the last time I used it as well. I think that it's really a lovely work. Yeah, there's the problem of canonizing, entering canonizing, that sounds so funny, putting, of making some composers canonical and others. And I think that another problem of textbooks is probably the copyright permission problem. Being married to a textbook author, I know that much as she's tried to diversify and add interesting recent works, she's been beaten back by copyright permissions. And that can also be a real hill to climb. But I mean, I hope they don't go away. For one thing, for people who aren't in as privileged positions as I am, and who are teaching 5-6 classes, especially our adjunct faculty. I mean, how on earth can they possibly create their own curriculum without documents like that can help them out?
I think that's
Sure.
a really good. Oh, go ahead, Judy.
You were first, Bob. You go first.
I think Michael's point is really good about the fact that I think a lot of us here are in a very privileged position where we have time to choose our own pieces and to build our curricula the way we want them to, in a way that people who maybe have less prep time aren't able to. And I think textbooks are especially useful there. It occurs to me that most textbooks have a couple parts, and one is strictly the technical nuts and bolts, and one is a selection of analyses and pieces. Sometimes these are mixed, of course, because there are often examples drawn from pieces. In my case, I have kind of developed a couple of handouts which do a lot of the nuts and bolts stuff. So I have one on 12-tone theory, I have one on pitch class set theory. They're really pretty dry. It's just like, this is how you find normal forms, this is how you look things up on the list of set classes. But the nice thing about those is I can reuse them all the time. I use them in different courses, my little thing. I know, Judy, you shared with us a set theory primer, which is sort of the same kind of thing. So I like that. I do that, and then I choose my own pieces for different courses, and I can still refer back to that technical thing.
Right. So I'm the more radical one here. I never have used a text. I don't intend to use a text. And for the very reasons that you mentioned, Joe, is that it tends to canonize things. And I always want to do what people are doing now. And so the problem of text also is that it locks you into a certain time span. So, part of the solution is doing something like what Bob says, that you have something that gives you some tools, and then you build something around it. I mean, the issue of contingent faculty is a real one. And I mean, I know what we've tried to do at my institution is we try to share things a lot. So all of our materials, we have I don't know what system you use. We have this Blackboard, and everything goes up there, and we share classes and we share materials all over the place, so that it's, you know, we kind of, you end up developing this faculty driven curriculum that is shared by lots of people, so that you have more flexibility. It's a more nimble approach than a textbook based approach.
You know, just an afterthought on this, because I was talking about the difficulty sometimes of getting new pieces, especially new pieces by composers who are still emerging, into a curriculum. Often the big challenge is just finding the necessary background, a little bit about where they're coming from, a little bit about the concepts that are useful. I mean, I know a lot of variety in contemporary music, but even so, it really helps to have a talk by the composer or a preliminary analysis. I think there could be a lot to do in the sort of open music theory kind of world, or some conference papers have been great. There are pieces in my curriculum by Dai Fujikura and Tanya Tagak that I was really only able to address because there were really good SMT papers on them this year. So that was just a perfect kind of setup for a class. I said, okay, I can assign the SMT video. We can look at the score together, and that will at least give us a place to start. But I would just maybe reinforce this, that it's so useful to have not even a lesson plan, but some preliminary research that lays the groundwork. And I think that a big part of diversifying the curriculum could be a kind of collaborative project. The more we can get that stuff out there in one form or another, the easier it will be for any professor, any instructor to just be able to pick up a piece and bring it in with, you know, it'll take some work, it'll take some prep, but it will be possible to contextualize that. I don't think that needs to be organized necessarily, but it's helped me a lot to find those things.
I'm just going to go for the darker side of this, because what Bob suggested is a really and Judy suggested is a really lovely kind of aesthetic of faculty working together and sharing freely. But there's also the question of valuing work, and there's it takes a lot of work to make a textbook, obviously, and there's the question of institutional value. So one of the things that we were concerned about when we changed learning systems, we're now on Canvas, we were on Blackboard. You have my pity, Judy. Canvas is really not much better. But so we're on Canvas, and we wanted to make sure that the university couldn't willy-nilly decide that this class that was formerly taught by me is now going to be taught by this other person. I'm just going to give them all of Buchler's materials. And so we wanted to make sure that faculty had ownership of their own intellectual property. And this is a fuzzy period where a fuzzy region where we want to make sure we want to be generous and we want to share widely, but we also want to make sure that faculty ownership rights aren't trampled on. I'm also married to our union grievance chair, so I'll say that.
No, I think that's a good point, Michael, is that people do put in a lot of time for these things, and you don't want somebody just, you know, taking your thing wholesale and saying, oh, it's mine, when it isn't, you know. And hopefully people have some integrity and they wouldn't do that, but you never know nowadays. So, but it is an issue, I understand.
We're approaching 5:30 here, so does anyone have a final question for our panelists? Yeah, Noah, go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks to all of you for these wonderful insights. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the relationship between what pieces to include and what sorts of theoretical techniques to include, which I think that's lurked between the surface of some other questions, but it seems like each of you take quite different approaches to that, judging by like how you frame the courses and what sorts of techniques and units are listed on your syllabus.
That's a great question, Noah. I'll take a plunge in here if you like. They're really closely related, obviously. And one question I was asking myself is whether when we diversify the list of composers we have, we necessarily diversify the list of topics. And it seems like that should be the case, that we're not just finding someone who does 12-tone music who is from an underrepresented minority, but we don't change the content. I've been interested in teaching more about rhythm. I'm not sure I'm entirely there yet, but I think that's actually an enormously useful thing to teach with a lot of ramifications for perception. How do we perceive projection of rhythm? How do we perceive meter? That might actually be something that transcends musical style in interesting ways too, to bring tonal music and post-tonal music closer together. I spent a lot of time on timbre as well, which is a big interest of mine. That seems to be something that sort of lacks a methodology, but you can introduce at least some ideas from acoustics, some ideas from composers' own lectures. And then the thing that really kind of crept into my syllabus when I did the counter canon course was repetition, and this idea of repetition, because there's so much more pulsed repetition and regular repetition in a lot of experimental music genres outside the kind of European avant-garde. So I think they're really closely related, theoretical topics and repertoire. The one thing that's interesting about 20th century music and 21st century music particularly is that there's a genuine distinction between kind of composer's theory and compositional techniques and analytical theory. And sometimes those overlap and sometimes they can be quite different. And I guess on that side, I try to teach a bit of both.
I'll just say that Bob's question on his handout, but on your post-tonal syllabus, you left out blank, kind of gets to Noah's question. And it's a question that I find myself asking myself all the time. How can I possibly leave this out? How can I, and sometimes it's a concept and sometimes it's a composer. And I've gotten more and more over it, and I'm more convinced that especially the really well-known composers are people that students are probably going to encounter anyway. So that gives more freedom. And the really well-known techniques are perhaps ones that students were going to find anyway. So I try to find a mix, but it's just a really hard question. That's, I think, has no particular answer, no satisfying answer.
Agreed. There's no really good answer to that. Because when I choose pieces, I choose pieces that I think speak to the cultural moment that we're in. And so I try to let the ideas about the music kind of flow from that somehow. I mean, clearly you've got us back to this idea of the archive. We have this archive of concepts, and we should draw on it when it's useful, but if it's not useful, you don't have to draw on it. So it's really a question of I don't want to use this term, letting the music determine what concepts to use, but there has to be some sort of dialogue between the analyst and the piece in the context of a class where you're determining what are the primary issues that arise. And I do like to say that, when I teach a piece in a class, we stick with it for a while and we share our ideas about it. Because every week, everybody has to make a presentation about some section of the music, and then we share it and talk about it, so that it becomes this kind of shared analysis that develops over the course of a couple of weeks with particular passage. And so I do think there is a kind of bubbling up of what the primary topics are in a kind of community setting there. And of course, I'm guiding it, but I'm there to listen to what the students have to say too.
That is something, Judy, that I really like about some of the materials you shared. And everything I shared feels very overstuffed in some ways. So there's almost a piece every new day. And I think we all know that you can't really do a deep analysis of a piece in 2 days, if you're a student, especially just coming to these things. So I have thought about for my next grad seminar, which I'm planning for the fall, just trying to take more time and maybe having 5 pieces that we talk about in the semester and really digging in. I don't think I'll do that with my undergraduate course because I do feel almost an obligation to share lots of repertoire. Like I said earlier, opening lots of doors for them in the hope that something clicks. But I think maybe for the grad students, it's important to model that long engagement and model that, that getting into a piece of music takes weeks sometimes. It takes hours and takes 20 listenings. That's what we should really be trying to let them know.
I agree. That's a really tough dance between overstuffing your course and really taking time, because I mean, the more time you spend on a piece, the less overall diverse your course is going to be, obviously, because you can't cover as much. But in past years, I've also, and I didn't do it this year, I've taken composers who I feel like get stereotyped. Lutoslawski is a particular favorite of mine, and I wanted to have them look at not one piece by him, but 2 or 3 that are radically different in style, to get people not to think, oh, this is what Lutoslawski said. Stravinsky's another one, obviously, who people think, Stravinsky sounds like the Rite of Spring. And it's good to beat down that stereotype as well, but that, of course, also comes at the cost of diversity. Sorry to end with 2 white dudes.
Yeah, well, it's probably good that we're ending on a difficult question like that. Please join me in thanking our 3 panelists today.
And thank you for organizing.
Yes, Zach has been an organizational force
Yeah.
in all this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Zach.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming this afternoon too. It was a really enjoyable conversation.
Great.